3-month-old German Shepherd puppy stepped into the middle of a rain-soaked Missouri road and refused to let Bennett Shaw pass. The former Navy SEAL was already late for a hospital meeting with his mother, one he had promised his family he would not miss, and for several seconds he almost chose the road ahead. The puppy ran toward an old house, stopped beneath the sagging porch, and looked back. When Bennett turned toward his truck, it hurried after him, caught his pant leg between its tiny teeth, and pulled with the last of its strength. Bennett looked at the hospital reminder glowing on his phone. Then he stopped. He followed the puppy toward the open door, believing he was stepping into a stranger's emergency. Before that morning was over, the choice would reach far beyond the house and force Bennett to reconsider the promise waiting for him at the hospital. Before the story begins, let us know where you're watching from today. It's always beautiful to see how many places a single story can reach. Late May had settled over Macon, Missouri, with a warm, heavy stillness that often followed a night of hard rain. Water rested beneath the maple trees in shallow pools. Flattened grass leaned toward the gutters, and broken clouds drifted east above fields, darkened by hours of steady weather. Pale sunlight was beginning to touch the roofs, although thunder still murmured somewhere beyond the county line. Bennett Shaw drove an aging blue pickup toward Macon County Hospital with both hands resting lightly on the wheel. At 39, the former Navy SEAL still carried habits that civilian life had never quite softened. He checked mirrors without thinking, noticed vehicles parked where they did not belong, and measured distance by exits, intersections, and clear lines of sight. These days, he worked as a maritime security consultant, traveling between ports, shipyards, and training facilities along the Atlantic coast. Macon was home only in the legal sense. His mother still lived in the white farmhouse where Bennett and his sister had grown up, and his name remained on an account at the local bank because Marjorie Shaw had never accepted that online banking was a trustworthy invention. Bennett kept a key to the back door on his ring, though he could not remember the last time he had used it without calling first. He had flown in from Virginia the previous evening after his sister, Cynthia, left 3 messages in less than an hour. Their mother had slipped in her kitchen, struck her shoulder against a cabinet, and spent 2 nights in the hospital for observation. The doctors believed she would recover, but her balance had been troubling her for months, and the family meeting, scheduled for 9 that morning, would determine whether she could safely return home. Cynthia had handled everything before Bennett arrived. She had spoken with the doctors, collected their mother's medications, fed the old barn cat, and found the insurance papers. Marjorie insisted were inside a green folder, but had actually placed beneath a stack of church newsletters. Bennett had landed after midnight, slept 4 restless hours in his childhood bedroom, and left before breakfast with the promise that he would reach the hospital early. The dashboard clock read 8:17. He still had time, provided nothing delayed him. Bennett passed the small brick post office, a closed barber shop, and a gas station where a man in coveralls was pushing rainwater away from the pumps with a wide broom. Macon had changed in small pieces since Bennett left, yet the town retained the same patient rhythm he remembered. Storefronts opened slowly, porch lights stayed on after sunrise, and people lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel when another truck passed. His phone rested in the cup holder beside a paper cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. A message from Cynthia waited on the screen. "Mom is asking if you're really coming." Bennett read it at a stop sign and turned the phone face down. He had missed important mornings before. His service had carried him through years when family news reached him late, filtered through secure phone calls and careful phrases. His father's first surgery had already ended by the time Bennett learned it had been scheduled. And the roof of the farmhouse had been replaced while he was somewhere his family was never allowed to name. Later, civilian work created different excuses. Flights were delayed, contracts ran long, weather closed airports, and another urgent problem always seemed to belong to someone who had paid for his attention. Each reason made sense when considered alone. The empty chair at the dinner table remained empty. This morning, Bennett intended to arrive before the decisions began. He wanted his mother to see him walk into the room while there was still time for his presence to matter, rather than hear another explanation after everyone else had carried the weight. He believed the hardest part of the morning would be deciding how much protection a family could offer before it began to feel like control. The wet road ahead was about to place a smaller stranger choice in front of him. Movement flashed from the grass on his right. Bennett's foot found the brake before he fully identified the shape. The pickup slowed sharply, tires whispering across the rain-dark pavement, and stopped with several feet to spare. A German Shepherd puppy stood in the center of the lane. The animal could not have been much older than 3 months. Its black and tan coat was damp along the belly and legs. One ear leaned sideways, while the other struggled to stand, and its paws seemed almost too large for the rest of its body. Mud clung to the fur above its toes, suggesting it had crossed more than 1 yard before reaching the road. The puppy stared through the windshield. Bennett waited for it to move, but it remained where it was, breathing quickly with its mouth slightly open. There was no collar around its neck, and no person appeared from the nearby houses to call it back. He tapped the horn once. The puppy startled and hurried toward the shoulder, its rear paws slipping briefly on the wet surface. Bennett eased the truck forward, expecting the animal to continue toward the grass. Instead, it swung around and stepped into the lane again. Bennett stopped. "Come on," he murmured, glancing toward the clock. "Pick a side." The puppy looked toward the far end of the street, then back at him. After several seconds, it ran along the road toward a row of older houses, its oversized paws throwing small drops of water behind it. Covered the distance of 2 driveways before stopping beneath a maple tree and turning around. Bennett watched. The puppy waited, then came back. His phone began to ring. Cynthia's name appeared on the screen, accompanied by a photograph taken years earlier in which she was laughing, and Bennett looked annoyed at having his picture taken. He reached toward the phone, but the puppy had arrived beside the driver's door and risen onto its hind legs. 2 muddy paws pressed against the metal. Bennett lowered the window several inches. The puppy stretched its nose toward the opening, gave a soft, breathless whine, then dropped back to the ground. It ran toward the end of the street once more and looked over its shoulder before returning. Cynthia's call ended. Bennett could have contacted animal control. He could have moved the puppy onto a lawn, called the hospital, and continued driving. Every practical part of the morning pointed in that direction. The puppy made the trip again. Its pace was slower now. One paw landed awkwardly near the curb, and the small body tilted before recovering. It did not appear injured, though fatigue had begun to show in the way its chest rose and fell. Bennett placed the truck in park. For a moment, he remained behind the wheel, looking at the hospital reminder on his phone. He imagined Cynthia standing in the hallway with her arms folded, while Marjorie pretended the meeting did not matter to her. He also watched the puppy sit directly ahead of the truck, rainwater darkening the fur beneath its chest. Its amber eyes stayed fixed on him. Bennett shut off the engine. The sudden quiet made the distant drip of water from the trees seem louder. He stepped out, closed the door, and walked around the front of the pickup, while the puppy rose uncertainly. Up close, Bennett could see that it was tired rather than frightened. Its ribs were not sharply visible. Its coat showed no sign of injury, and its attention kept returning to the same direction. "Where did you come from?" The puppy took several steps toward the end of the street, paused, then hurried back when Bennett failed to move. It brushed against his boot, circled once, and started forward again. Bennett looked toward the hospital road behind him. The puppy followed his gaze, then caught the loose fabric near the bottom of his trouser leg with its front teeth. The grip was gentle and brief. After releasing him, it ran ahead and waited. A message from Cynthia arrived. "They're ready for us." Bennett read it without answering. He slipped the phone into his pocket and lowered himself slightly until his eyes were closer to the puppy's level. "All right," he said. "Show me." The puppy turned at once. It ran toward the older end of the neighborhood, where the houses stood farther apart and mature trees leaned over the sidewalks. Bennett followed at a brisk walk, keeping enough distance to let the animal choose the direction, every few yards. The puppy looked back to confirm that he was still there. Small paw prints appeared and faded across the wet pavement. Bennett checked his watch once more, then continued after them. The muddy tracks led Bennett past 3 modest houses and ended at a blue-gray bungalow near the end of the street. Climbing roses framed the porch, their wet branches bent beneath the weight of the storm, and one section of gutter hung crooked above the steps. A garden faucet beside the house released a slow, steady drip into soil already dark with rain. The puppy hurried onto the porch and scratched at the front door. It stood partly open. Bennett stopped at the bottom step and studied the windows. The kitchen curtains remained drawn even though the morning had brightened, and no shadow moved behind the glass. He called toward the house, waited, then called again with enough force to carry through the rooms. No one answered. The puppy came down the steps, took hold of Bennett's trouser cuff for a moment, and returned to the door. Its paws clicked across the porch boards as it moved between the entrance and Bennett, too young to hide its urgency and too tired to keep running much farther. A screen door opened at the neighboring house. "You looking for Evelyn?" The man crossing the wet lawn appeared to be close to 70. He wore a plaid robe over work pants, house slippers darkened by the grass, and he leaned on a wooden cane with each careful step. Thin white hair lay flat against his head, as if he had dressed in a hurry and forgotten to check a mirror. Bennett pointed toward the puppy. "This dog belong here? That's Jasper." The man looked at the open door and his pace slowed. "Evelyn Pritchard took him in last month. Found him through a rescue outside Columbia." Jasper heard his name and gave the man a quick glance before returning to the doorway. "I'm Edwin Carver," the neighbor said. "I carried mail around Macon for 38 years. Evelyn taught home economics at the high school until she retired. She's been in this house since before half these trees were planted." "Does she live alone?" "Since Harold passed." Edwin shifted his grip on the cane. "She keeps a schedule better than the post office ever did." His attempt at humor faded as he looked toward the kitchen window. "Evelyn usually opened those curtains before 7, he explained. "She watered the garden after breakfast, checked the bird feeder, and began baking early on Thursdays because the library hosted a small afternoon gathering. Some weeks only 5 or 6 people came, though Evelyn prepared enough food for twice that number." The curtains were still closed. Edwin glanced at the porch floor. "Her downstairs light stayed on late last night. I heard Jasper crying after the thunder moved through, but she had pies to finish, so I figured the storm had him worked up." He rubbed one hand across the top of his cane. "My knee was bad, and the rain was coming sideways. I told myself I'd walk over this morning." Morning had arrived before Edwin did. Bennett climbed the porch steps and knocked hard enough to shake droplets from the rose leaves. He called Evelyn's name twice, listening after each attempt. while Jasper pressed close to the narrow gap at the door. The house remained quiet except for the low murmur of a radio somewhere inside. "Call 911, Bennett said. "Tell them the resident may be unable to answer. Stay here where the dispatcher can reach you." Edwin pulled a phone from the pocket of his robe. Bennett waited until the call connected, then identified himself loudly at the doorway and explained that he was entering to check on the homeowner. Edwin repeated the details to the operator while standing where he could see Bennett clearly. Bennett pushed the door open. Jasper slipped through first. The puppy raced into the kitchen, skidded on the wooden floor, and came back at once. Small nails tapped in quick bursts as it moved toward the hallway, returned to Bennett, then headed away again. The house held the warmth of a life interrupted in the middle of an ordinary morning. A radio near the kitchen window delivered a weather report at low volume, mentioning scattered showers and rising humidity across north-central Missouri. In the adjoining room, yellow thread still ran through the needle of a sewing machine, attached to the unfinished edge of a flowered apron. The kitchen smelled of butter, warm fruit, and damp summer air. A tray of strawberry rhubarb hand pies waited beside the stove, shaped and brushed with egg wash, though none had reached the oven. Flour dusted the work surface. A pale film had formed across a cup of tea near the sink, and 3 brown paper bags stood beside a box of kitchen twine. Bennett moved past the table, then stopped. A name had been written across the nearest bag in careful blue ink. For Marjorie Shaw, save her usual chair. He read the line again. His mother had never mentioned Evelyn Pritchard. She had spoken about the library only in passing, usually when Cynthia offered to drive her there. Bennett had assumed those afternoons were errands, something small enough to forget. Jasper whined from the hallway. Bennett left the bag where it stood and followed. The puppy waited near a narrow door at the end of the hall, scratching at the lower panel, before turning in a tight circle. A faint line of cool air moved beneath the door and carried the smell of wet concrete. Every room behind Bennett suggested that Evelyn planned to return within minutes. The narrow door offered the first sign that the morning had broken away from her routine. He opened it. A steep wooden staircase descended into a dim basement. The air below was cooler and heavy, with damp earth metal and the stale scent of rainwater that had found its way indoors. Somewhere beneath the house, a mechanical hum should have been running, yet the sump pump remained silent. Bennett listened. At first, the sound blended with water dripping along the foundation. Then it came again, measured and faint. 3 slow taps. Silence. 2 more followed, weaker than the first. "Edwin," Bennett called without taking his eyes from the stairs. "Tell the dispatcher we have someone in the basement. Ask them to update fire and medical." Edwin's voice changed as he repeated the message. Jasper pushed against Bennett's boot, trying to squeeze past. The puppy placed one paw on the first step, slipped on the damp edge, and drew back with a startled whine. Bennett lowered one hand across its chest and guided it onto the dry hallway floor. "Stay here, Jasper." The puppy remained at the doorway, body tense and ears uneven, watching as Bennett tested the first stair with his weight. He descended carefully, using the wall for balance, while his eyes adjusted to the low light. The tapping had stopped. At the bottom, a narrow wash of gray morning light entered through a small window near the ceiling. Shelves, canning jars, and folded tables formed shadowed shapes along the walls, while a thin layer of stormwater reflected the basement bulb in broken pieces. Near the far wall, an old metal shelving unit had tipped forward and come to rest across the floor. A gray-haired woman lay partly hidden behind its tilted frame. The gray-haired woman lay behind the tilted frame of the shelving unit, one shoulder against the concrete wall and her lower body partly hidden beneath its crossbars. Several jars had rolled across the floor without breaking, and an empty canning lid rested loosely between her fingers. Bennett raised his flashlight. "Evelyn," her eyes opened slowly. "Here." The response was faint, though clear enough to tell him she understood where she was. He took one step toward her, then stopped when his light caught a dark cable hanging near the foundation wall. A section of its outer covering had split. The basement appeared quiet enough to cross. That single detail changed the room. Rainwater had entered along one corner after the sump pump stopped, spreading a shallow, reflective layer across part of the floor. The damaged wire ended only a short distance above it, and Bennett had no way to know whether the circuit remained live. "Don't move," he told Evelyn. "I need to shut the power off before I come closer." A tired smile touched one side of her mouth. "Wasn't planning on going anywhere." Bennett backed toward the stairs without turning away from her. Jasper stood several steps above him, body lowered and ears uneven, listening for Evelyn's voice. "Edwin," Bennett called. "Where's her main panel?" "In the laundry alcove beside the kitchen. Turn off the main breaker. Tell the dispatcher there's water in the basement and damaged wiring." Edwin moved more quickly than his cane suggested he could. A moment later, the bulb above Bennett went dark, the radio upstairs fell silent, and the weak hum from the house disappeared. Bennett waited. "Main is off," Edwin called. Bennett checked the basement again with his flashlight before stepping around the wettest section. He placed each foot carefully, using shelves and support posts only after testing them, until he reached the dry concrete beside Evelyn. Up close, he could see how the accident had happened. The old shelving unit had pulled away from the wall, likely when Evelyn tried to slide a heavy box of jars from the lowest level. Its frame had tipped forward and settled across her leg and the side of her hip, leaving her unable to shift without moving the entire structure. There was no visible sign of a severe wound. A scrape ran along one forearm, her lips were dry, and exhaustion had softened her voice. "Can you tell me your full name?" "Evelyn Ruth Pritchard." "Do you know what day it is?" "Thursday." She paused. "Unless I missed more than one. How long have you been down here?" "The storm had just started, sometime after 6 last night." "Nearly 15 hours." Bennett asked where she felt the most discomfort and whether she could move her toes. Evelyn answered each question, sometimes after a pause, while he studied the points where the shelf met the floor. "Jasper?" she asked. "He found me." Her fingers closed around the canning lid. "Good boy." Bennett glanced toward the stairs. The puppy stood in the doorway above, shifting its weight from paw to paw, unwilling to leave and uncertain of the dark space below. "The fire department is coming," Bennett said. "I'm going to keep the shelf from moving until they get here." "You sound like you've done this before." "I've waited for better equipment before." That earned another small smile. A tool bench stood several feet away, with boards stacked beneath it and an old hydraulic jack pushed against the wall. Bennett retrieved a thick plank, checked it for rot, then positioned it beneath a solid section of the shelf frame. He placed the jack under the board and raised it slowly until the metal stopped, pressing downward. The shelf creaked once. Bennett stopped and watched every connection point before continuing. When the weight had lifted only enough to reduce the pressure, he slid 2 wooden blocks beneath the frame and lowered the jack against them. He did not attempt to pull Evelyn free. The structure was stable for the moment, and rushing the final step could undo the care that had brought them this far. He sat on the dry floor, within her view, keeping one hand near the support, while distant sirens began to rise beyond the neighborhood. "Stay with me," he said. "Tell me about the pies upstairs." Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, then opened them again. "Strawberry rhubarb." "I noticed." "They'll be ruined. They haven't been baked. That may be worse." Bennett looked toward the stairs. Jasper probably disagrees. At the sound of his name, the puppy gave a soft whine. Evelyn's breathing steadied enough for her to continue. She explained that Jasper usually hid beneath the kitchen table whenever thunder rolled across town. He disliked hard rain, the vacuum cleaner, and a metal mixing bowl that slipped from the counter during his first week in the house. The previous night had been different. He kept coming down the stairs, she said. Wouldn't stay upstairs. I told him to go hide, but he kept returning. When did he leave? After daylight, I think. I heard the dog door. Bennett pictured the small animal crossing wet yards, reaching the road, and testing one passing vehicle after another until someone finally stopped. Jasper had no training and no understanding of rescue. He had simply refused to accept the silence beneath the house. The sirens grew louder. With the pressure eased and help approaching, the basement had begun to feel less threatening. Jasper was still waiting for the one voice he recognized. "Bring him to the bottom step," Evelyn whispered. Bennett looked at the dry path along the wall. The power was off, the wire was clear of the route, and the shallow water remained several feet away. He called Jasper gently. The puppy descended with his body low, testing each step before moving to the next. At the bottom, he hesitated until Bennett guided him along the dry concrete, then crept toward Evelyn with his belly close to the floor. "Easy," Bennett said. Jasper reached her arm and pressed his face beneath her hand. Evelyn could lift only 2 fingers, though it was enough to touch the fur between his ears. The puppy became still. So did she. Boots sounded overhead as firefighters entered the house. Bennett gave them a brief account of the damaged wiring, the water, Evelyn's condition, and the temporary supports. The crew inspected his work, replaced it with rescue equipment, and prepared Evelyn for removal, while a paramedic checked her breathing and circulation. Bennett stepped back. The firefighters raised the shelf in a controlled motion and freed Evelyn without rushing her. They placed her on a padded stretcher, covered her with a light blanket, and carried her toward the stairs while Jasper followed as closely as the crew allowed. By the time they reached the porch, sunlight had broken through the clouds. Water dripped from the damaged gutter, and the pavement beyond the yard was already beginning to lose its dark shine. Edwin stood beside the ambulance with one hand around Jasper's chest. The older man lowered his head when Evelyn passed. He seemed ready to speak, yet no words came. His eyes remained on the stretcher until the paramedics lifted it into the vehicle. The rescue had answered why Jasper ran into the road. The kitchen upstairs still held another connection Bennett did not understand. Before the ambulance doors closed, Evelyn turned her head toward him. The bag with Marjorie's name. Bennett stepped closer. "Marjorie Shaw is my mother." A flicker of recognition crossed Evelyn's tired face. She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod as though a familiar name had finally found its proper place. "Tell her I saved her chair." The doors closed. The ambulance pulled away from the curb, its siren soft at first, and then fading as it turned toward the hospital. Jasper strained once against Edwin's hands before settling beside his cane. Bennett looked down at his watch. The meeting with his mother had begun more than 30 minutes earlier. By the time Bennett reached Macon County Hospital, the morning rain had thinned to a damp haze above the parking lot. Mud had dried in uneven streaks along his trouser legs. Rust dust marked one sleeve, and the hospital clock over the recovery wing showed that the family meeting had been underway for nearly 40 minutes. Cynthia stood outside their mother's room with a folder pressed against her chest. Her eyes moved from Bennett's clothes to his watch. "You always have a reason," she said. "Most of them are good ones." Bennett could have explained the puppy, the flooded basement, or the ambulance that had passed him 2 streets from the hospital. Cynthia's face told him that the truth of this morning would not erase the shape of all the others. "I'm sorry," he said. She held his gaze for another moment, then opened the door. Marjorie Shaw sat upright in a wheelchair near the window, wearing the pale blue cardigan Cynthia had brought from home. A cane rested beside her foot, and a clipboard lay across her lap with several handwritten corrections in the margins. At 73, she still had the brisk attention of the dental receptionist who had once managed appointments, insurance forms, nervous children, and 3 dentists who regularly lost their own schedules. A physician stood beside the bed, discussing balance assessments, medication changes, and the possibility of temporary assisted living. Marjorie tapped one finger against the clipboard. "You keep saying temporary, as if that word makes the room mine." The physician lowered his voice and explained that the recommendation was meant to reduce the chance of another fall. Cynthia mentioned the narrow hallway at the farmhouse, the loose rug near the kitchen, and the basement steps their mother still used when she wanted canned peaches. Marjorie looked from one face to another. "I am sitting right here." The room fell quiet. Bennett took the chair beside her rather than joining the others near the foot of the bed. Her hand rested on the arm of the wheelchair, close enough for him to see the faint bruising near her wrist. "I should been here," he said. Yes, Marjorie did not soften the word for him. She also did not look away. Bennett had arrived prepared to explain another delay. The name waiting in Evelyn's kitchen changed the conversation before he could begin. "Do you know Evelyn Pritchard?" Marjorie's attention sharpened. "Why?" "She was brought in this morning. She had an accident at home." The clipboard shifted against her knees. "Is she hurt badly?" "She was awake when the ambulance left. They were checking her downstairs." Marjorie looked toward Cynthia, then back at Bennett. "How do you know, Evelyn?" "Her puppy stopped my truck." For the first time since he entered, Cynthia's expression changed. Marjorie listened as Bennett described the open front door, the basement, Edwin's call to 911, and the firefighters who had taken over the rescue. He kept the account plain and left out the details that belonged to Evelyn alone. Then he told them about the paper bag on the kitchen table. "For Marjorie Shaw," he said. "Save her usual chair." Marjorie lowered her eyes. Cynthia pulled a chair closer. "What chair?" "The one near the library window." The answer came quietly. Marjorie explained that she and Evelyn had met years earlier during a small recipe exchange at the public library. People brought handwritten cards, family stories, and whatever food they could carry without spilling in the car. Some afternoons drew a full room. Others ended with 4 women drinking coffee, while Evelyn wrapped leftovers for people who had stopped coming. Marjorie had gone almost every Thursday. After her fall, she stopped. "I didn't want everyone watching me cross the room with a cane," she said. "Did Evelyn know that?" Cynthia asked. "She knew I was staying home." Every week, Evelyn had kept the chair by the window empty. She sent messages through other library visitors, included Marjorie's name on recipe copies, and once left a jar of peach preserves with the librarian because she knew Cynthia would eventually collect it. The unfinished hand pies had never been meant as a casual gift. Evelyn had been trying to bring her back. By late afternoon, the medical meeting had lost the hard edges it carried that morning. No final decision had been made, and Marjorie remained irritated by nearly every suggestion involving grab bars, medication organizers, or someone else holding a spare key. Still, she listened longer than before. A nurse later found Bennett near the vending machines and told him Evelyn was stable. The tests showed no major injury, though she would need rest, observation, and time before moving comfortably again. Evelyn had asked whether Marjorie Shaw was still in the building. The hospital maintained a small garden behind the rehabilitation wing, bordered by brick paths and raised flower beds. Sunlight had broken through the clouds by then, warming the wet benches while water continued to fall from the leaves in slow drops. Marjorie arrived in her wheelchair, with Bennett pushing from behind. Cynthia walked beside them, carrying the cane, and Evelyn waited beneath a covered section of the patio with a light blanket over her knees. Edwin stood nearby, holding Jasper's leash. The nurse had allowed the puppy into the outdoor garden after Edwin promised to keep him away from the indoor recovery area. Jasper wore a borrowed red collar and seemed cleaner than he had that morning, though one streak of mud remained beneath his chin. When he saw Evelyn, he lunged forward with more enthusiasm than balance. His front paws missed her knee the first time. On the second attempt, he slid against the side of the chair and sat down, as if the mistake had been intentional. Marjorie laughed. It was the first unguarded sound Bennett had heard from her all day. Evelyn bent carefully and rubbed the soft place between Jasper's uneven ears. "You caused enough trouble for one morning." The puppy placed one paw on her shoe. Edwin looked toward the garden bed. "He had help." Evelyn glanced at him, and the years of being neighbors passed through the silence between them. Edwin tightened his hand around the cane, ready to apologize, though she spared him the speech. "You told me that shelf was loose," she said. "I should have come over last night. I should have let you fix it last month." Marjorie looked at Evelyn. "You knew? I knew it needed screws. I decided knowing was close enough to fixing." A small smile moved across Marjorie's face, then disappeared as she glanced at the cane Cynthia had leaned against the bench. Evelyn noticed. "I also kept telling people I was perfectly capable of carrying boxes down basement steps," she continued. "That sentence sounds different after 15 hours on a concrete floor." Marjorie adjusted the edge of her cardigan. "I may have ignored a few dizzy spells." Cynthia opened her mouth, then let the moment remain between the two women. Neither of them needed a lecture. Each had already heard her own stubbornness spoken in the other's voice. The conversation drifted toward practical things. Evelyn agreed to let Edwin repair the basement, shelving and porch rail before she returned home. Marjorie listened while Bennett suggested removing the loose kitchen rug, adding a handrail near the back steps, and placing an alert button where she would actually wear it instead of leaving it in a drawer. Evelyn rested both hands over the blanket. A house can still belong to you after someone else gets a key. Marjorie studied the damp garden beyond the patio. Depends who gets it, then choose carefully. A breeze moved through the flowers, carrying the smell of wet soil and cut grass. Jasper settled between the two chairs, his chin resting across Edwin's shoe. The discussion seemed to be reaching another careful stalemate. Then Evelyn asked Edwin to hand her the cloth bag hanging from the back of her chair. Inside was a stack of blank recipe cards. "I need someone to write the names," she said. "My hand will be unsteady for a while." Marjorie looked at the cards, then at Evelyn. "My handwriting is still better than yours." It always was. Evelyn placed the stack in her lap. Bennett watched his mother run one thumb across the top card, already considering where the first line should begin. The cane remained beside her chair, though it no longer held the center of her attention. The family postponed any decision about assisted living. Bennett and Cynthia would make the farmhouse safer, keep regular contact, and attend the next medical review together. Marjorie agreed to wear an emergency alert device, report any dizziness, and stop treating every offer of help as an attempt to remove her from her own life. She also agreed to return to the library with Evelyn. No one received everything they had asked for. They left the garden with enough. The first days of June brought clear mornings to Macon, followed by humid afternoons and brief showers that sometimes crossed town while sunlight still shone at the end of the street. Evelyn returned home with instructions to limit the weight on her right leg, rest often, and accept help with anything involving stairs. Jasper settled once he saw her beside the living room window again, though he followed her from room to room with the solemn attention of a guard dog who had not yet grown into his paws. He waited outside the bathroom. He waited beside the refrigerator. When Evelyn moved from one chair to another, Jasper moved too. Bennett extended his stay in Macon by a week. His contract manager in Virginia rearranged 2 meetings. Cynthia brought him a clean set of clothes from the farmhouse, and Marjorie pretended she had never doubted that he would remain until the work was finished. At Evelyn's house, Bennett removed the old basement shelving and replaced it with a frame anchored securely to the wall. Heavy boxes were moved to waist height. Empty jars went onto the upper shelves, and a brighter light was installed above the stairs. He also placed a battery lantern near the basement door and wrote the date of the repair inside the electrical panel. Edwin worked outside. He replaced a softened porch board, tightened the railing, and realigned the section of gutter that had twisted during the storm. His knee forced him to stop often, yet each morning he returned with a different tool and the day's mail tucked beneath one arm. Before the accident, Edwin had watched Evelyn's house from across the fence and trusted routine to tell him she was well. Now he carried the mail to her door and waited until he heard her answer. Some lessons arrived quietly. At the Shaw farmhouse, Bennett and Cynthia rolled up the loose kitchen rug, cleared a narrow path between the bedroom and bathroom, and installed grab bars where Marjorie could reach them without stretching. The emergency alert button was placed beside her watch each morning, close enough that forgetting it would require effort. Marjorie inspected every change. "The bathroom bar is crooked," she said. Bennett held a level against it. "It's straight. It drops toward the window." "By how much?" "1/4 inch." Cynthia leaned against the doorframe. "You realize he used to work with military navigation equipment." Marjorie folded her arms. "Then he should be able to fix a crooked bar." Bennett measured it again. The bar was level, but he loosened one side, adjusted it a fraction, and tightened the screws. Marjorie examined the result. "Better." Her mouth had already begun to smile. For several days, the farmhouse had sounded like a medical assessment. Medication schedules, safe footwear, follow-up appointments, and questions about whether Marjorie felt dizzy when she stood. That small argument returned something familiar to the kitchen. Cynthia laughed while packing away the tools, and Bennett accepted a second cup of coffee before leaving. Across town, another part of the agreement was taking shape. The public library had scheduled an early June gathering called Recipes We Remember. Visitors would bring a family recipe and, when they wished, tell the story of the person who had taught it to them. Evelyn had planned the event months earlier with the librarian, hoping it might bring people back to a building that had grown quieter each season. Weekend hours were under review. Fewer people were using the reading room. Volunteer shifts had become difficult to fill, and some town meetings now took place in a larger community center near the highway. Evelyn had no intention of canceling. She also refused to let the gathering become a public retelling of the basement accident. A reporter from the weekly newspaper called after hearing about Jasper's trip into the road. The editor believed a story about a puppy finding help would attract readers, and Bennett understood the appeal. Evelyn listened politely from her kitchen chair, thanked the reporter, and declined. When the call ended, she set the phone on the table. "I don't want people coming to stare at the woman who got trapped under a shelf." Marjorie sat across from her with a black pen and a stack of blank recipe cards. Her cane rested against the table, close enough to reach without asking. "Then don't tell them about the shelf," she said. "Tell them why your mother put salt in the crust." Evelyn looked at the empty card between them. The accident had brought attention to her house. The recipe could lead people somewhere else. My mother said fruit needed something to argue with, Evelyn replied. Marjorie began writing. That sounds like her. The revised newspaper piece appeared 2 days later. It focused on family recipes that had survived hard seasons, cross-country moves, and the loss of people whose handwriting still remained on stained index cards. Jasper's role received one brief paragraph near the end, presented as the reason Evelyn was able to continue preparing for the library gathering. That was enough. Evelyn's strawberry rhubarb hand pies came from a summer when her mother's garden produced little besides rhubarb and a short row of strawberries. Money had been scarce. Several relatives were expected for Sunday supper, and the remaining fruit would not fill a full pie plate. Her mother divided the dough into smaller portions, folded each one around a spoonful of filling, and added a pinch of salt to keep the sweetness from becoming flat. The hand pies became a family habit. Evelyn prepared the dough from her chair, while Marjorie measured the fruit and wrote labels in the careful script she had used for appointment cards at the dental office. Each brown paper package received a small note describing that difficult summer, and the woman who had made limited ingredients feel generous. Bennett handled the oven trays. Cynthia tied the packages with twine. Edwin delivered 2 baskets of strawberries from a roadside stand and stayed to repair a cabinet hinge that had bothered Evelyn for years. Jasper slept beneath the table through most of the work. He woke when a piece of baked crust fell near Marjorie's shoe. The puppy seized it, carried it into the living room, and sat behind an armchair with his back straight, and the stolen piece held between his paws. His expression suggested official business. Marjorie leaned against the table, laughing hard enough that Cynthia moved the fruit bowl out of reach. Evelyn called Jasper a thief, though she made no effort to retrieve the crust before he finished it. The kitchen filled with warm pastry, summer fruit, and voices that no longer lowered themselves whenever someone mentioned a cane or a missed appointment. Rain crossed the backyard for less than 10 minutes, tapping against the window before passing into sunlight. Bennett stood near the doorway with a dish towel over one shoulder. Marjorie bent over the recipe cards, correcting Evelyn's spelling and arranging the finished labels in neat rows. Her voice carried easily through the room, and her back appeared straighter than it had in the hospital garden. The grab bars mattered. The alert button mattered. So did the clear hallway and the phone calls Cynthia had added to the family calendar. Yet Bennett could see another measure of safety taking shape at the kitchen table. It lived in the people who expected Marjorie to arrive, the work that still required her hands, and the friend who noticed when her usual chair remained empty. The morning of recipes, we remember, began with a light rain that darkened the streets around downtown Macon and left the smell of wet earth along the library steps. By noon, the clouds had started to separate, and broad bands of sunlight entered through the tall front windows. They fell across the wooden tables Bennett and Edwin had arranged in a wide circle. Evelyn sat near the hand pies with Jasper stretched beneath her chair. His leash rested loosely around her wrist, and one ear had finally begun to stand, while the other still leaned toward the side. Each time someone approached the food table, his nose lifted with hopeful concentration. Marjorie managed the recipe cards and registration book. She straightened crooked pages, corrected incomplete addresses, and directed every new arrival toward the proper table with the calm authority of someone returning to familiar work. Her cane stood beside her chair, within easy reach, while the emergency alert button remained visible beside her watch. Bennett noticed both. Edwin entered, carrying a basket of rhubarb from Evelyn's garden. He set it near the doorway, tested the railing with one hand, then came inside without mentioning the repair. Cynthia followed with extra pens and a box of paper name tags. For several minutes, the room remained quiet enough for Bennett to hear rainwater slipping from the gutters. Evelyn had prepared 30 hand pies, and Marjorie had brought 60 blank recipe cards. The empty chairs around the tables made both numbers seem optimistic. Evelyn looked toward the windows. People may be waiting for the weather to clear. Marjorie turned one of the cards until it aligned with the edge of the table. Then they'll arrive with clean shoes. The front door opened before Evelyn could answer. A retired mechanic came in, carrying a folded sheet of notebook paper inside a plastic bag. The recipe belonged to his late wife, who had made corn soup whenever one of their children came home sick. He had never cooked it himself, though he remembered every ingredient she placed on the counter. A woman from the Methodist church brought an index card, written in her mother's small, slanted handwriting. Flour had softened one corner, and a dark stain covered half the word cinnamon. She refused Marjorie's offer of a clean copy. "That mark has been there since 1978, she said. "It stays." More people followed. Some had read about Jasper in the weekly newspaper. They entered looking for the puppy who had stopped a truck and found help for his owner. Jasper accepted their attention for several minutes, then crawled beneath the table after becoming overwhelmed by shoes, voices, and hands reaching toward his uneven ears. The people stayed after he disappeared from view. They stayed for recipes that carried the names of mothers, husbands, grandmothers, and neighbors. They stayed for stories about kitchens with cracked linoleum, Sunday tables extended with folding leaves, and meals stretched through difficult years by adding more potatoes to the pot. Few visitors brought no recipe at all. They found seats and listened. The room filled slowly, then all at once. Chairs were carried in from the children's section. The final hand pies were divided into halves, and Cynthia opened another page in the registration book. Marjorie began writing names on cards when several visitors admitted they had forgotten their reading glasses. Her usual chair near the window remained occupied. Evelyn had feared that the accident would follow her into every conversation, reducing an entire life to one morning beneath a fallen shelf. The gathering gave the town something fuller to remember. She moved from table to table with a cane borrowed from the hospital, asking where each recipe came from and correcting people when they shortened the stories too much. She explained why her mother added salt to the pastry crust, reminded Jasper to leave the paper basket alone, and sent Edwin back for the rhubarb after he forgot where he had placed it. No one treated her like a display of misfortune. She had work to do. The library board had planned to review weekend hours later that month. Attendance had declined, volunteer shifts remained open, and several programs had been postponed because too few people registered. That afternoon offered a practical answer. 7 visitors signed up for future volunteer shifts. 12 requested another recipe gathering in July. A local church group offered to help cover Saturday programs, while 2 retired teachers volunteered to lead a weekly reading hour. The commitments were modest, yet they gave the board enough reason to keep the summer schedule in place. The library proved its value through the people using it. Near the end of the gathering, Bennett stood beside Cynthia at the back of the room. Their mother was helping the retired mechanic rewrite his wife's soup recipe, pausing often so he could remember whether the cream went in before or after the corn. Cynthia held the assisted living brochure they had received at the hospital. "We should keep it," she said. Bennett nodded. "We should." Their mother's health still required attention. The alert button could not remain on the dresser. Dizzy spells had to be reported, and the family would need to adjust if her balance worsened. Today had given them a better way to measure the life they were trying to protect. Cynthia folded the brochure and placed it in her bag. Across the room, Marjorie laughed at something Evelyn said. Her hand rested on a stack of recipe cards, and 3 people waited for her help. The empty chairs had once seemed like evidence that the library was fading. By late afternoon, Bennett and Edwin had to search the storage room for more. When the final visitors began to leave, sunlight had dried most of the sidewalk. The air outside carried the clean warmth that followed a brief summer rain, and the open windows moved just enough to stir the paper signs taped near the entrance. Edwin carried empty baskets to Evelyn's car. Cynthia gathered unused name tags, while Marjorie checked the registration book twice before closing it. Bennett started stacking chairs. Jasper had fallen asleep beneath one of the tables. One small paw rested across the toe of Bennett's shoe, as though the puppy had finally decided someone else could remain watchful for a while. Marjorie approached with her cane in one hand and her purse over the other shoulder. "Are you staying for dinner?" Bennett looked at his watch. His flight left early the following morning. A rental car needed to be returned, his bag remained unpacked, and several messages from Virginia were waiting on his phone. For years, a schedule like that had ended the conversation before anyone asked the question. He removed the watch and placed it on the table beside the recipe cards. "What are we having?" Marjorie smiled. "Leftovers, then I'll stay." He lifted another chair and added it to the stack. "I have come to believe that loyalty often reveals itself through ordinary choices. It may look like a puppy refusing to leave a wet road, a neighbor finally crossing the yard, 2 women allowing friendship to carry part of their burden, or a son learning that protection also means honoring the reasons someone still wants to rise each morning. People who live alone rarely ask to become someone else's responsibility. Most hope only to remain visible. So think of someone whose curtains usually open at the same hour, whose porch light follows a familiar pattern, or whose chair has been empty longer than usual. Make the call. Walk across the yard. Stay long enough to listen. And if this story brought someone to your heart, share their name or memory in the comments so others can hold them in prayer. May we become more attentive to the quiet signals around us. And may no one in our community be forgotten, simply because they learned to live without asking for help. Stories of loyalty, healing, and quiet courage matter to you. Your support helps us continue telling them. What stays with me is not the basement or the ambulance. It is the chair near the library window, the unopened curtains, the careful handwriting on a paper bag, and a muddy puppy waiting in the road because someone inside the house could no longer call for help. Stories like this may begin in imagination, yet the lives beneath them are familiar. Families worry about aging parents. Proud people hide weakness. Neighbors notice something unusual and sometimes wait a little too long before crossing the yard. Those truths belong to real kitchens, real hospital rooms, and real small towns. Perhaps grace often arrives quietly. It may come through a dog that refuses to leave, a friend who keeps a seat empty, or a son who finally puts his watch down and stays for supper. I believe God sometimes works through ordinary people who simply choose to pay attention. There may be someone in your life whose routine has changed, or someone who once noticed when you were missing. Share that memory, a prayer, or a thought in the comments. If these grounded human stories mean something to you, a like and subscription help more people find them. May God bless your home with attentive hearts, steady kindness, and people who remember to check the empty chair.